I'm Ryan Bronson, Director of Government Affairs for the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. We are a 225,000 member organization with hunters across the country dedicated to elk, other wildlife, their habitat, and our hunting heritage. Today we have with us three members of Congress. First, Mary Peltola represents Alaska. She's an at-large representative for the state. Dan Newhouse represents Washington's 4th Congressional District. And Harriet Hageman is the representative from Wyoming with the at-large seat in Congress from Wyoming. Thank you, members, for being here. So migration corridors is a very important issue for the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and other sportsmen's organizations. Big game and other wildlife depend on summer habitat and winter habitat and the ability to move from one to the other over the year. Secretarial Order 3362 was established several years ago in 2018, and in the first couple of years it worked very well in that the Fish and Wildlife Service and other interior departments were getting their directives from the Secretary to implement it. However, in recent years, we've had trouble securing the kinds of resources to help states continue to do their migratory corridor work. What can Congress do to invigorate the state and federal collaboration to ensure progress on critical big game migration habitat?
Well, in Alaska, this is a big issue. We have a caribou herd that migrates over almost 2,000 miles every year to do their calving and get away from predation and have access to more food. And we do have a checkerboard system in Alaska as well as the lower 48, and I think states need to be working together as well, and our agencies need to do a much better job collaborating, especially between the state and the federal agencies. Dan?
Well, thank you, Mary. And Ryan, first, let me just say thanks to the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation for doing this, for giving a little bit of, attention to some of the issues that we're working on that are important to your members. We really appreciate that time. And, you know, one of the biggest things is just what you're talking about, these migration corridors. We need to, as Congress, understand their importance. I think they're important to know what the challenges that wildlife face, the risks they face, and some of the solutions. But probably the most important thing we can do as Congress is to make sure that those state and local organizations have the support that they need to work together to accomplish these important goals. So we're going to keep our eyes on this issue and do whatever we can to give that support.
I think that this is one of the areas where stockpiling too much power back in Washington, D.C. creates problems when you're trying to actually solve something such as dealing with wildlife corridors. Really, the critical aspect of this is to make sure that our local, state, and private landowners are stakeholders and are involved in the discussions and the decisions that are made with wildlife corridors. We also need to make sure that we're doing proper management. And we should not be bureaucratizing everything to make it so incredibly difficult that when we do identify wildlife corridors, we're able to move forward quickly with actually managing the resource so that it benefits the wildlife itself.
Thank you. And the University of Wyoming has been a tremendous partner for us, leading the way on mapping those corridors. And it's something that our organization has invested a lot of resources into. We recently allocated $250,000 to continue the mapping efforts across the West, so we appreciate that. So one of the issues that often does get into the newspapers is fire. So decades of litigation has led to a lot of overgrown forests in much of the West. Elk and other wildlife benefit from diverse forests with mixed age types and age openings, and the kinds of habitat that's often created by small fire and also by forest management practices, thinning and timber harvest. Unfortunately, the conditions that we are starting to see in national forests is leading to hotter and more destructive fires that destroy habitat, property, and oftentimes human lives. Congress has invested a lot of resources in recent years on fire management. Are we making any progress?
Well, this goes back to my response to the first question. The national forests were created under the 1897 Organic Act, and they were created for two purposes: to provide a continuous supply of timber and a continuous supply of water. Over the last 25 years especially, they have been mismanaged on an absolute colossal scale. And you can go back to 2001 with the adoption of the Clinton roadless rule that has created most of the problems, where they denied access, management, and use to 58.5 million acres of National Forest Service lands in the western United States, including 3.2 million acres in the state of Wyoming. That is where you really see the increase in the catastrophic forest fires, because it was at that point that they also stopped any kind of treatment for the pine beetle outbreak that resulted from the 1997 blowdown in the Route National Forest and those sorts of things. So the reality is that our Forest Service has failed us in terms of the management of the resource, in large part because of the ongoing litigation. At one point, the Forest Service was the most sued agency of any federal agency. We need to be making more progress. We need to recognize that forest treatment and management is critical to our wildlife and providing wildlife habitat. And until we do that, we're going to continue to see catastrophic forest fires that are really destructive to our communities.
So Ryan, and I agree with exactly with what Harriet has to say. I guess one thing I could add is we are literally millions of acres behind in managing our forests. We've got a lot of ground to cover, a lot of ground to make up. And over the short time I've been in Congress, we've been investing in this, trying to change that mindset of the Forest Service that Harriet referenced. And it's going to take continued focus and effort on the part of Congress to make sure that we keep pushing, we keep funding, we keep making sure that the right work is being done to try to catch up on the, you don't have to drive very far into the public lands to see how much work has to be done. It's overwhelming, and we've got to stay focused on that.
Yeah, we had a large tundra fire in Alaska that was about the size of Delaware, and we're seeing more and more tundra fires, more and more really deadly, catastrophic wildfires across our nation, and that includes Alaska. And it is a huge contributor to carbon. I think that is really more of a carbon bomb than petroleum production is at this point. And I think it's going to get worse before it gets better unless we are much more proactive. And I'm really glad that Representative Hageman mentioned the roadless rule in terms of cheaper renewable energy like hydro projects that don't impact salmon. The roadless rule has been a real hindrance for forward progress there.
And if I could just add one more point, you guys, as you talk, more things come to mind. The impacts of catastrophic fires certainly are huge in our forested areas. But where I live in the valley of central Washington, where a lot of agriculture takes place, and the more and more frequent catastrophic fires that we're seeing has a huge impact on the whole region. Where the crops are being raised, we now there's a term that is relatively new called smoke taint, where a lot of the crops are being negatively impacted by weeks and months of continuous smoke-filled valleys. And that's having a huge impact on the value of our agricultural production.
Well, in part because of the unique group of legislators that we have here today, I'm going to bring up the topic of grizzly bears. So grizzlies are currently listed as endangered in the lower 48. They were delisted for a little while in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. There's a lot of interest in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem for potential delisting. There is a proposal on the table from the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service to introduce grizzlies into the Northern Cascades in Representative Newhouse's district. And of course, Alaska is where grizzlies are not endangered and are common and even hunted today. So I'm going to start with Representative Peltola because you've got a lot of grizzly bears in your state. Talk to us about how the state manages bears in your area and any of the issues you see that might be emerging.
Well, we do have a large number of bears, and many Alaskans feel that we do need predator control to manage those bears. There are whole regions of Alaska, whole game units where you can't find a moose to kill because they've been aced out by our grizzlies and our wolves. And both of those issues are really important to food security, making sure that we're managing those. And even if you're in a city like Juneau, our capital city, if you fry up a pan of bacon, you will have a mama sow and 2 cubs right outside your window. We had 19 bear maulings last year in Alaska, and the only common thread was that each of the victims was unarmed.
Wow. So the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation has issued comments on the proposal for the Northern Cascades. We're concerned. Elk populations are below objective in that region. So in adding additional predator pressure in an area where there's spruce disease and other issues that are affecting potential food sources for grizzlies, maybe not top priority for the federal government, but it's right in your backyard, Representative Newhouse. So tell us what your thoughts are on the Northern Cascade proposal.
So, how much time do we have here? The grizzly bear issue is something that's been being pushed by the Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service for several years now. We were able to beat it back during the last administration, fortunately. The agencies in the previous administration finally listened to the residents of North Central Washington who have spoken out loud and clear that they do not want these grizzlies introduced there, to add to the wolves and the cougar population that we already have and are already experiencing lots of management issues with, particularly with our livestock producers and the communities that live in this area. This is probably, and it touches on some of the other issues that we'll probably talk about too, the fact that the local voices, in my humble opinion, are the ones that should be listened to the most. They're the ones that are going to have to deal with those maulings that Mary was discussing and pointing out that are happening in Alaska. That's something, instead of listening to people from all over the country, even all over the world, that have some kind of removed interest in this, I think the people that are actually right there in the front row seats of having to deal with grizzly bears are the ones that the Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service need to spend more time and attention of listening to and being able to work through whatever management plan they come up with. And that's what I'm not seeing that at this point. There needs to be more attention paid to these people.
Home of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem.
Well, I think that the grizzly bear is an example of the Endangered Species Act being used as a zoning mechanism and a land use mechanism rather than actual recovery of the species. So the grizzly bear population in Wyoming got down to about 136 animals in the mid-1970s. But right now, after Wyoming has invested over $59 million in grizzly bear recovery, we have over 1,100 bears. Our recovery goal was 500 bears. We have more than double the number of bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem that were required by the recovery plan. And Wyoming has a very robust management plan in place where we will protect a recovered grizzly bear population, just as we have been able to protect the recovered gray wolf population after they were introduced into the Yellowstone National Park in 1994. So we're actually extremely good at managing wildlife in Wyoming. And a lot of people think that if a species is on the endangered species list, that you've got these federal employees that come out and do the management, and that's just not reality. It's your state and local governments that actually manage the resource that we're talking about, whether it's the grizzly bear or the gray wolf or the black-footed ferret or whatever it is. It's our Game and Fish Department, and they're excellent at managing these species, at counting them, at knowing where they are. But at the same time, what happens, and this is why the Endangered Species Act has become so broken and why the amount of money that we spend on species recovery has become cost prohibitive, because we continue to spend money on species that are fully recovered, but because we can use them to control land use in large areas, such as in Wyoming, in eastern Washington, in Alaska, Alaska, we can't get the Fish and Wildlife Service or the courts to allow us to delist them. That's one of the things we have to do if we're going to fix the Endangered Species Act to where it actually is used to recover species and we can have some success stories. We spend millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars every year working on species that are fully recovered and do not need to be protected. And because of that, we are not able to spend the resources in and direct the money the way that we should. I think the grizzly bear and the gray wolf populations both are classic examples of that. Alaska, Wyoming, Washington have been affected by those species in a way that most people don't understand. But one of the impacts is that we're not capable then of spending money. When we direct resources over here where they shouldn't be spent, we're incapable of actually directing and spending that money where it should be. And that is, again, a classic example of why the ESA is broken and one area that needs to be fixed. We need to do a better job of delisting when a species warrants being delisted, and the states have a management plan in place to protect those species.
Yeah, so if delisting were to occur, the state of Wyoming would manage their bears, the state of Montana would manage their bears, the state of Alaska already manages their bears. States are very capable managers of wildlife. In fact, they manage most of the wildlife species we have, with the exception of migratory waterfowl, where there's the nexus of crossing state lines, and endangered species. Those are really the only two places that it comes up. We've talked a little bit about endangered species. I'm going to circle back to that a little bit. So the Equal Access to Justice Act was a law that was written, really intended to let the little guy be able to stand up to the federal government in litigation and be able to have, if they win the court case, to have their attorney's fees returned to them. Unfortunately, there's a loophole in the law, and maybe it was on purpose, but nonprofits, which the Elk Foundation is, we're a 501c3 nonprofit, but nonprofits have no income or cap on how much they can recover under the Endangered Species, under the Equal Access to Justice Act. And so there's a number of litigious organizations that sue over and over and over again and are able to recover millions of dollars in attorney's fees, sometimes at exorbitant rates, because they're exempted from any sort of means testing, where an individual or a corporation has means testing. And so we're seeing that a lot of the suits that we're dealing with on endangered species or NEPA, or based under the Cottonwood decision, which is a forest management and endangered species issue, the folks bringing suits are actually, it's a fundraising mechanism for them because they're getting paid back for it. We're interested as an organization in reforming the Equal Access to Justice Act as one mechanism for reforming litigation. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that, and if you have any other thoughts on ways that here in our 50th year of the Endangered Species Act that we can make some reforms to make that program, very important program, work better.
I'll take a first stab. I think that permitting reform in particular, NEPA reform, is crucial if we're going to get serious about meeting our energy demands in this country. And it's not, a lot of folks don't know that NEPA doesn't just apply to petroleum projects, it also applies to natural renewable projects. And in Alaska, it takes about 10 years to permit a project. It takes about 100 state and federal permits. And now it's taking even longer than 10 years. I think that average has been extended because of this issue with litigation. And it's a real sore spot for Alaskans when you talk about these organizations that use these causes as fundraisers, because most of the time, the majority of the people involved in their organizations, the vast majority who contribute, have never been to Alaska, will probably never go there, will never have an opportunity to talk to an Alaskan or an Alaskan native who wants these projects, who needs these projects to go forward. And it's just a real disservice that 60% of our land, over 60% of our land, is owned by the federal government, which gives people in every state of the union license to feel that they have more say-so in what goes on in Alaska than Alaskans do. So this is a real sore spot for us.
So Ryan, we, as chairman of the Western Caucus, I and the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, Bruce Westerman, we put together a working group to look at things that could be done to reform the Endangered Species Act. Like you said, it's 50 years old. Its track record under any way you measure it, if you look at the number of species that have ever come off the list as opposed to being put on the list, is dismal at best. I think it's less than 5% of those species is ever deemed unlisted. So we're looking at lots of different things, and this is one of them. Something that was put in with good intentions to make sure, like you said, the little guy has a voice, which I think we need to protect. Organizations have found ways to abuse the system, take advantage of it, and not only use it as a membership or a fundraising mechanism, but it's a continuous circle of lawsuits that get into what Harriet was referring to, or actually controlling land use and stopping potential projects from being developed in the first place, so that we could develop some of the resources that we have. And so we've got to look at maybe raising some of those metrics that are used to whether or not an organization can take advantage of this program, looking at ways how we define some of the legal activities that are covered by it. But we've got to get away from the weaponization of the very act that's meant to protect species and is failing horribly.
So the Equal Access to Justice Act was a mechanism by which you could get your attorney's fees and costs if either the federal government sued you or you sued the federal government. And there's a variety of ways in which those lawsuits move forward. But to just give you an example, you're referencing the means testing. And you talk about what are essentially sue and settle lawsuits, where environmental groups will sue a particular federal agency. They go in the back room, and they reach a settlement. They walk out and say, we're entitled to $800 an hour. And there are cases where they are literally receiving $300,000 and $400,000 and $500,000 in attorney's fees, if not more, for relatively simple cases. But what's interesting is the way I've seen the EAJA weaponized is it depends upon which side of the aisle and which party you're defending or prosecuting as to whether you could get the fees or not. I've sued the federal government on many, many occasions and beat them. But even when I win, the federal judge will not give me my attorney's fees and costs. Yet when I am involved in lawsuits where environmental groups sue the federal agencies, they always get their attorney's fees and costs. And I'm just going to give you two examples of where the federal judge, after me winning lawsuits against the federal government, turned around and said, yeah, I know you should be entitled to these, but I really didn't like I don't like your position. So I brought the first lawsuit challenging the wolves, the gray wolf management by the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2002. We had met our recovery goals. We had 3 to 4 times the number of wolves in Wyoming that we were required to under the recovery plan. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service refused to delist them. So I sued on behalf of 28 different organizations in the state of Wyoming. It took us 15 years, but we eventually won. In 2017, we got them permanently delisted in the state of Wyoming. Throughout most of that time, I did my work for free or at a substantially reduced rate, simply because it was such an important issue for our wildlife, for our livestock producers, for our communities, for our hunters and fishermen, for our sportsmen's groups. It was such an important issue. My attorney's fees and costs after 15 years of litigation was $35,000 because I did most of my work for free. The judge denied my request for EAJA funds because he didn't want me to win. So even though I won, it took that amount of time. Another case, I had a gentleman that I represented who had moved an irrigation ditch on his property. The federal government came in. He affected 2.1 acres of land by moving an irrigation ditch. The EPA came in and claimed that irrigation ditch was a navigable water of the United States. They brought an enforcement action against him under the Clean Water Act. When we went to trial, he was facing penalties of almost $65 million because they were imposing fines of $37,500 a day. We had a 2-week trial. The jury was out for 2.5 hours and came back and ruled in favor of my client. When I filed the EAJA claim for $1 million for the attorney's fees and expert witness fees, the judge said, I didn't want your client to win. I didn't think that the EPA was wrong, and he refused to give me my attorney's fees and costs. So the EIJA is not only broken because it creates a sue and settle incentive, and we are funding these radical environmental groups through this mechanism, but even when you're in the right, if the judge disagrees with the position you're taking, even if you're legally correct, you don't get EIJA funds. So it is something that needs to be fixed because it should be content neutral.
Appreciate that. I think our last question today, since we're running low on time, I wanted to talk about when Congress passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, it included a provision that prevented the Department of Education from funding grants for school hunter safety education and outdoor programs based on an interpretation by a Department of Education employee. The provision also prevented the funding of survival training programs in Alaska, which is really how it came to light. We found out that these hunter education classes in Alaska were going to lose, the federal funding through the federal grant program through education. So the Western Caucus was extremely helpful in helping us pass a fix to that legislation and getting that done. I can tell you that the Elk Foundation membership lit up the phones of their members of Congress on that issue like no other issue. We have thousands of members that are hunter ed instructors and folks that participate in that. I was wondering, Representative Peltola, if you could talk about the importance of those hunter ed classes and the hunter survival training that is occurring in Alaska schools.
Sure, I was really proud to support that fix. It's very personal. I think that there's this misnotion among city folks or people who don't grow up hunting that, I'll just phrase it a different way. For me, hunting is an act of love. Hunting and sharing hunting skills and spending time with your kids, spending time with your parents or your hunting partner, that is camaraderie and love, and the values that you teach your children when you're hunting about respect for your kill, respect for the land, how to read the weather, how to read the land, those are all critical skills and really apply to the rest of your life. I think that those are critical building blocks for young people. And just time outdoors is mental health. And so to have people misinterpret the way, and it's a family affair, that's the other thing. It really it's strange to me that this isn't more broadly understood. And in terms of hunter safety and hunter and survival skills, we have, just in the last 5 or 10 years, we've had 2 instances where young people were having to survive for multiple nights in a row in the winter, in the snow. We had 2 high school kids go out on a snow day ptarmigan hunting. They got lost. They survived for 3 or 4 nights. It was quite miraculous with very minimal long-term effect. They had some frostbite, but that's to be expected. We also had an instance where 3 little kids, 2 elementary school age brothers and their toddler brother went to the dump. They took their family snow machine to the dump. They got lost. They wound up actually closer to the next village over, and they survived for 2 nights. And that toddler had no frostbite. And we're fortunate in the region that I'm from that we do have a lot of hunter training skills and survival skills that are taught to children. But this isn't something that we can take for granted. These kids were really blessed that they had grown up in this way. And, I need to hear something about 7 times before it sinks in. And I don't think I'm that far out of the ordinary. I think that repetition is important, and having these positive messages come from multiple sources and schools reinforcing the values of the families of the kids that they're teaching, I think is really important.
So Representative Newhouse, this was an issue that bipartisan support helped get that over the top. As chairman of the Western Caucus, you're helping us lead a bipartisan panel here today. I want to thank you for that and all the work that the Western Caucus does. If there's anything that our members need to know about the Western Caucus, what is it?
Well, Ryan, again, thank you very much for giving us time to talk about some of the important issues. As you can see, we've got experts in the field as to some of the major challenges that we are trying to solve as a country. My biggest message to those folks that are listening as it relates to the Western Caucus is we exist to elevate the voices of Americans that live in rural America. That and your example of all you lit up the phone lines on this education issue. Thank you for that. I think that's proof that the system can work. We can impact outcomes of legislation if people's voices are heard. And that's what the Western Caucus was created to do. And I just want to thank you for helping us accomplish our mission.
Well, thank you. The Elk Foundation wants elk from coast to coast in all the places that elk used to be, but the West is obviously where we spend so much of our time and effort, and the Western Caucus are great partners. Thank you, all three of you, for being here today, and I want to thank everyone for your time today. Have fun at the rodeo.
Thank you, Ryan.